So I watched Destroyer and Momo's legendary weapon tier list a while back, which is a good video. If you haven't checked it out, you should. But after watching it, I felt like there was some commentary on some weapons that was missing on how those weapons actually perform in their damage. And there was also a little bit of lack of focus, in my opinion, sometimes on the video. So they focused mostly on PvE, looting, but then there was also some PvP, some group looting, sometimes just how cool the weapon was. So I wanted to make my own tier list with a different focus, specifically how much DPS the weapons are able to put out, how useful their niches are if they have any, and then also how useful the weapon is to chase or try to obtain when comparing against all other weapons in the game, especially if two weapons are rather similar. The higher one is going to get a higher rank, and then the other one that is similar, that should get a similar rank, I'm going to put lower because it's just not as valuable at that point to obtain. Okay, so first up we have Behemoth Blade. Behemoth Blade is one of the original weapons in the game, but it has gone through changes since TLOPO. Specifically, it has Titan's Curse on it now, which is a crazy good skill. I think it's personally very slept on. It gives you a 40% buff, whereas all the other buffs on swords are only 20%, so it's twice as good in that. It lasts a long time. It's about 12 seconds, I think, after it's gone through its full animation. And it's also a cooldown skill, which many swords do not have. They use break attacks. So you're always able to get Titan's Curse back at the beginning of a boss fight. And that's where I find most of its utility. Behemoth Blade isn't really high DPS, I would say. It's middling as far as legendaries. It's still very good DPS as far as all weapons in the game. But it's not S tier. I don't think it's A tier DPS. But it does have this unique niche in that you can swap to it after a boss is killed, have it ready, pop it, and then have 40% buff on whatever you want to swap to. And for that reason, I think even though it's probably got what I would say is B tier DPS, I think it deserves A tier because of its niche. Okay, next up we have Patron. So what's interesting about Patron is that it's just kind of a baby form of Behemoth Blade. So it has Ghost form, which also charges, and you can also get it ready before a boss fight. But it's only going to be a 20% buff, like all the other buffs. So it's not as valuable, and it doesn't fulfill that same niche that you would want from Behemoth Blade. So like I said, in comparison, it's just going to be lower, even though it has a good niche in the same way that Behemoth Blade does. It's also a cutlass, and it has pretty bad attack for a legendary. Sweep boost is not helpful, so its DPS is relatively low as far as legendary weapons. So I think most people would not be using Patron, or really going for Patron. I don't think it's F tier. To me, F tier is just completely useless. So I think we'll put Patron in D tier. Okay, next we have World Eater Blade, Web. I think this is a really easy S tier for most people, and I would agree. I don't think it's amazing DPS. It's sort of on the upper end, maybe upper B tier DPS, I would say. But just the drain health is really useful. Drain voodoo is also helpful occasionally. Free sweep is okay for DPS, but it's really just mainly the drain health that is so good for web, and it gets you out of a lot of situations as far as being able to stay alive enough to do damage, because that is the other aspect. We can do really high DPS, but if we can't stay alive, what does it matter? So web can get you out of a pinch, or just let you kill something that you otherwise really shouldn't be able to do. So for that reason, I think web is incredibly useful and is an S tier item. Next we have Thunderspine. I think in Destroyer's video, Thunderspine was higher up than what I would put. In my opinion, Thunderspine is not that good. I think its DPS is good. It's not great, especially due to it being a cutlass. Most of the cutlasses are not going to perform that well. Shock Sweep is very good damage. Thrust and crit are helpful on it, but it's just not enough to get it out of the fact that it is a cutlass. and its attack is not as high as it could be. We have a lot of 1-0 whatever broadswords. Those perform very well. Given the fact that its DPS is not that good, and it doesn't really have any other niche, I think I'm going to put it in C tier. For Blade of the Abyss next, so I think the allure of Abyss is to be able to get a really high Bloodfire going, which a max Bloodfire is a 50% boost to your damage, which is very good. There's a lot of weapons that get a 50% boost, and it immediately makes it into very high, maybe even S tier DPS when it's hitting that niche. Blade of Abyss, its niche, Bloodfire, is very hard to consistently have up. You would be able to do it if you are killing many enemies in a row to keep the Bloodfire going. At this point in the game, in my opinion, that is a rather hard ask. Enemies hit very hard. If you're trying to relentlessly attack, then you need some other form of healing. Maybe you could pop potions. You need someone helping. In my opinion, that makes it a lesser weapon. When it has Bloodfire up, it is, again, like I said, a very S tier, A tier weapon. But for the most part, I don't think you're going to be able to use it in that way, especially not anymore. It's not really going to get you a high Bloodfire on bosses, so I'm more looking at its DPS when it doesn't have Bloodfire up or very high at all. And to me, that is a D tier DPS from how it stacks up, so we're going to D tier. Yore is weird. It does have okay DPS, maybe about B, C tier. It does have a really good amount of boosts that do actually help its DPS, but again, Cutlass, very hard. Its weapon skill is not that good. It just doesn't do that much damage, and it's a bit trickier to use. Most people, including myself, only really got it as a collector's item and use it as a fancy way of rolling around and moving faster. But you could just use a famed weapon and get the same thing out of it, so it doesn't even really benefit you in that way. It's really, in my opinion, just a collector's item. You could go get other things that are better, and it doesn't do anything beyond the movement aspect, which you could just get something easier for. So, I'm sorry, Yore, but you are going in F tier. Next we have JSB, more recent addition to the game. Captain's Fury does a high amount of damage for a break attack skill on swords. It's also got crit, which does help a little bit on DPS. It is a Cutlass, so it's not going to be great. What makes it really unique is Skeletal Scourge. That gives you 50% buff when you're attacking skeletons. Now, there's not really a lot of skeletons in the game that you would want that as far as farming for Legendaries, especially once you get JSB, because then you'll be done with Darkheart, and that's one of the two, the other being Hex, skeletal bosses that you would even want this for. So once you get it, you've really only got one thing left to make use of, and Hex is an easy boss. So at least right now in the game, its niche is interesting, but not that helpful, unfortunately. Maybe down the line we get more skeletal bosses, and that's nice, but right now, not ideal. It's interesting. It would probably be an F tier-ish, D tier-ish, if it didn't have Skeletal Scourge. When it's hitting that niche, it's pretty good, and if I'm hopeful in the future for a new skeleton boss, then maybe let's call it B tier. Next up is Ridgeway. Ridgeway is a bit weird to me to try to place. It does have Drain Health 3 like Web, which in theory, based on what I said with Web, should make it amazing. But I don't feel the same way about Ridgeway. It's a Cutlass, so it's not going to be good, like I've been saying. It's 90 attack, which is pretty low. Captain's Resolve is not that helpful, in my opinion. It does have Flourish Boost, which is okay, but it just doesn't do that much damage. It's one of the lowest DPS legendary weapons in the game right now, and since Drain Health is based on the damage that you're doing, the amount of Drain Health is going to also be less, so it's not healing as much as Web. Now the fact that it is able to be gotten from a quest makes it helpful for newer players if they don't want to, say, go for Tyrant Blade to heal them, but I don't think it's should be that tricky for these players, newer players, if they're in that position, to be going for Tyrant Blade and then pass over this for one of the other really good options from finishing Bilgewater. So I don't think it deserves D tier, so I think I'm going to put it in C tier. Devil's Claw is really bad, in my opinion. I don't think I could give it F tier. It's not completely useless, but it's almost F tier. It almost really deserves it. It has sure-footed, which makes it a bit unique, but there's not really any enemies that you could make use of that on, other than Dry Rot, where you're getting Devil's Claw from, where you're in a position to be getting a legendary that is unique. Hurricane Slash is okay. Bladestorm boost is okay. Most swords don't really get a huge DPS boost from using Bladestorm, so that doesn't really help a lot, because it doesn't end up being used that much for a high DPS. 89 attack sucks, Cutlass sucks, so its DPS ends up being very low as far as legendaries. So I think I'm going to safely put it in D tier. Next up is Levy. I made a video a while back on swords, and I think I kind of bashed Levy, or at least like people using Levy, when there are better options out there in some situations. And I still believe that. Kind of an elitist opinion still of mine. But Levy is, I will confess, is still very good, and I use it in many situations myself. Leviathan's Curse does a lot of damage for a skill, and you're able to get it back at the beginning of a boss fight. The other things on it, they're okay. It's a broadsword, which is good. 108 attack's great. So it ends up getting pretty much top tier, sometimes A tier DPS most of the time. It's a lot better when the bosses or enemy is dying very, very quickly, because then your quick 10k from Levy's Curse, X amount from Bladestorm boost, I don't know the number off the top of my head, those make it a very high DPS in those moments. And so I think Levy has its own niche in doing really high instant damage compared to other swords, and also a high AoE, since Leviathan's Curse has a moderate range on it, so you can also use it for enemy farming too in those spots. So I think it's an easy S tier. I wanted to tackle Triton right after that because it is a little baby version of Leviathan, is how I like to think about it. It has worse attack, it has a worse special skill, but it's relatively similar in its function. You get attack and toe back. It's a little baby version edition of Leviathan's Curse, but it has a significant amount of damage. And then it's still a broadsword. It has reverse spin cut boost. And then it's got Triton's Vengeance, which again is a 50% boost on that enemy. But there's really not any jumbies that you would regularly be trying to fight. There is the Halloween event, where Wind Shadow is a jumbie, but that can be helpful. He's a very high HP boss, but usually people will go for other options that chew through its health percentage based, as opposed to Triton, or just using healing options to make sure they don't die, because he does do a lot of damage. So Triton is not S tier in my opinion, just because of Levy, but I think it does deserve A tier. It does do very good DPS. Soul Shadow is, now I'm actually thinking its DPS is more close to Yore, which is not too great. Maybe around Thunderspine as well, kind of that range of DPS from the charts. And that's not really great. It also has Dark Curse on it, which is a little bit helpful, but isn't the most amazing sword skill. It's also got crit and jumping boost, those help the DPS, but just not enough. It's got a low-ish attack for legendaries. So just given that its DPS is not that great, it doesn't do anything unique, we're going to put it in C tier. Krakenslayer, on the other hand, next is very useful. It has 99 attack, which is a little bit lower than other broadswords of the same kind. It does have Dark Curse, which is a little bit helpful. Bladestorm boost on it of +4 is a bit unique. Bladestorm doesn't help DPS too much, but Bladestorm boost on it makes it go to +9, which does make that Bladestorm do a lot of instant damage, which can be helpful sometimes to swap to. The main appeal to it to me, though, is Dutchman's Wrath, which gives it 50% more damage on Ila Tormenta enemies, and there are a lot of bosses there, including where you get Krakenslayer from, where you would find that 50% boost really helpful, because on those enemies it does become a top DPS option. So it's not useful on every enemy, but you'll find a lot of enemies there that you'll want to be killing anyway. I wouldn't call it a S tier because of that, so I'm going to give it A. Now, next up we got a line of all the Sabres in the game. So they're all sort of in a similar boat, so I kind of wanted to tackle them together. Ruby, among the 4 cursed ones, is the top DPS option most of the time, if not all of the time. Inferno Sweep is just a tiny bit worse damage, well, maybe not a tiny bit, a decent amount worse damage than Free Sweep on Sap. And Sap also has 104 attack as opposed to 102. But if you're using this on a boss, then you're probably going to want to go with Ruby Curse, because Inferno Sweep charges fast, and it also applies a fire dot, damage over time, onto the enemy, and fire damage does damage based on the current health of the enemy. So if they have a lot of health currently, then it's going to do a significant amount of damage, and that damage adds up, and it ends up making it just a little bit better than Sap. So Ruby's damage also, just comparing against all of them, ends up being high to top DPS. Not the tippity top, but up there, top spots. So I think, in my opinion, Ruby gets the S tier. It's useful in every situation. It doesn't really have a niche. It's just very good damage. Now, like I was saying earlier, because you could just go for Ruby, which makes it better in all the situations compared to Sap, I could put Sap in F tier. Not going to do that. It's still a very valuable weapon, so I'm going to put it in A tier. Emerald and Onyx do a significant amount less damage than Sap. There's a decent drop going to Emerald and then a big drop going to Onyx in their DPS. I'm going to put Emerald in B, and I'm going to put Onyx in C, probably the upper end of C because it's still not bad. And then now we have Silver Striker. This is used, well, it used to be awful when it was a Cutlass, and then it recently got changed to a Saber, which makes it a decent amount better, but it kind of retains some of its poorer stats. 88 attack is not so great. Cyclone Boost is pretty good. Power Slash is actually a pretty high damaging attack, and it also charges relatively quickly if I remember right. So I'm gonna put it just below Emerald here in B tier. Okay, finally we're done with swords, so now we can move on to daggers, starting with Silver Freeze. Now, in my head, throwing knives are all awful, and Silver Freeze is just the king of these awful weapons. It still actually does do better damage than El Patron, but since I put that in D tier, as you can see, that's not actually very good. So, relatively bad attack, Silver Freeze, whatever, Blade Instinct, okay. So, just going on the DPS alone, I'm going to put it above Patron here in D tier. Now we've got the normal daggers, so we're starting off with Dark Whisper. Dark Whisper is also another weapon with Drain Health. It actually has rank 4, but unfortunately the dagger attacks aren't as high damage as we would see in Web, so the amount of health that you're draining back is going to be a little bit less. It does have Dark Curse as well, which actually helps in this case because you take less damage when you're in that form, so it's a bit easier to stay alive, and you do a little bit more damage, so the healing is a bit easier to keep up, even on the highest damaging bosses. Using Dark Curse, having that halved damage and higher attack, but you're also going to be putting dots on it, and that's what makes daggers interesting nowadays. So you're going to be able to apply Wound. It's higher on enemies than it is bosses, but it's really only important on bosses. So each time you hit a boss, you're going to put 3 stacks of Wound, and every stack of Wound is going to do 0.05% of the boss's total health that they're starting with per tick per stack when it goes off. Ticks are roughly a second or a second and a half. So doesn't sound like a lot, 0.05%, but once you get enough stacks and you're ticking every second, it ends up adding up, especially if you're taking a while to kill the boss. So if you're taking a while to kill, it kind of balances out the DPS and makes it good, but ideally you're not going to be in a situation where you really need to pull this out, in my opinion. Ideally you are killing the boss in a better way than that. I do really like the concept of wounds, so it kind of pains me to say that, but its DPS doesn't end up being that good. So I think its DPS is more around, say, the B tier range, I would say. Now, kind of same line of thinking with Hornet Stinger. It's going to get the wound, and it's going to be a little bit more useful on a boss that has very high HP that you want to chew through. It doesn't have the survivability aspect, so you're going to hopefully not be the person getting attacked, which is sometimes a little bit hard when you're using Hornet Stinger correctly. But what makes it really cool is that if you're able to stay alive with it, it also has Venom Strike on it, so that's going to put a Venom Dot that does damage 1% if it's an enemy, 0.5% if it's a boss, per tick, per roughly second. So, and that's also just on its overall HP, not its current HP, so that's going to maintain consistency. So you've got that going, plus wound going when you're using it, and then also Venom Stab, when you can use it, applies a dot over time that is a little bit stronger than the normal poison, and it's also HP based, so you're just going to chew through a very high boss. And because of all the stacking of these percents, it actually gets into the S tier rank, like top tier DPS. So I actually think that Hornet Stinger deserves being an S tier because of its really high effectiveness in that niche, attacking these high HP bosses as long as you're able to stay alive. Now we're done with daggers. We can move on to guns. We're going to start off with Beckett's pistol. So it's got very high attack for a pistol, not in the face, who cares. It has +5 steel shot boost. Now, right now this might, well, hopefully it changes, but the damage that you get from putting points into an aim style like Take Aim versus an ammo like Steel Shot Boost, it's a bit less when you put stuff into an ammo as opposed to an aim style. It's 20% when you take aim until you get to 5, and then it's half of that, 10% when you go 6, 7, 8. But Steel Shot, or any ammo, ticks up less than 20%. I want to say it's about 16%. So the +5 sounds really good on paper, but it ends up not being, I think it's about the same as its Take Aim +8, which you can see in Mercer's, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So it is a very good weapon. It can kind of get not top DPS, but relatively high DPS, A tier-ish DPS by itself, and it doesn't have anything otherwise as far as its niche going on. So I think it's safe to put it in A tier. Now we have Mercer's, which is the direct comparison, and I feel like one of my early influences in the game when it was coming out, and I was able to compare the two weapons and show that Mercer's was a bit better. Now that Feint is actually working, it's kind of debatable if it's better or not, because Feint is really annoying to deal with. There's a lot of enemies that do a melee attack, and then Feint activates, and then you are sitting there not doing damage. So Crit Strike is really good on it. Take Aim Boost is really good on it. Eagle Eye is good, and it's going to be doing the same attack number as Beckett's, but with crit, and the Take Aim Boost gets a little bit higher. So it is going to be better than Beckett's as far as DPS. I wouldn't say it's S tier DPS, just because of the fact that Feint is really annoying. So I'm just going to put it tucked away just right ahead of Beckett's. Now we have Jack Sparrow's Revenge, one of the newer additions to the game. I mean, Point Blank on it is really strong. It takes a while to charge up, but it does a high amount of damage relative to the gun's shooting that you would do normally. Skeletal Scourge is going to do 50% more damage on skeletons, and then you also have Silver Shot Boost to really go hard into that niche of killing skeletons. when you're outside of killing skeletons without the 50% boost and without using Silver Shot, unless you want to do like 10% of your damage, it's fine. It's not really that good at that point because it doesn't have those boosters that we get from the other two pistols, and it has the same attack. So at that point, it's kind of but when it's fitting its niche, it's very good, and you could get this before you get legendaries from the other two skeleton bosses that you could get legendaries from. So in that way, it's kind of good. If there were more skeletons, it could be better. So I think probably B tier, just because this niche isn't as useful as the other two pistols. They're more generally useful. Finishing guns, we have O Silver. This is not a pistol, but a repeater pistol, and it's unique in having 4 barrels instead of 3. Quick load on it is very good. It just slightly increases your DPS when you have it active, and it doesn't take too long to get back up, I believe. Crit Strike is very good on it, of course, just doubling your damage occasionally. Dodge boost, whatever, the rest of it doesn't matter. 48 attack is incredibly high for a repeater pistol, and its DPS ends up being even above Mercer's, which is already an A tier, and it doesn't need to have to worry about feint activating and lower your DPS. You just have to worry about occasionally increasing your DPS with a quick load. So I don't think I can really put it in S tier. I don't think it's quite up there, but I think it's towards the higher end of A tier. Now we're on to dolls. There's 2 dolls. First one is going to be Calypso's Radiance. This one isn't actually useful in DPS, except for maybe life drain boost, or just life drain, because of its boost, getting it to +8 if you put all your investment points into it. And then that actually does do a substantial amount of damage at that point. But that's about the only reason I would use it. Other than that, you have a curse boost, which could help. I haven't really found that necessary. It's just kind of an extra bonus on it. 70 attack's pretty good for a doll. Yeah, but really, most of the utility in it, to me, is just the very quick life drain attack, which is almost in my head as much as doing a Leviathan's curse, just without needing to charge it. You would have to swap, which is lowering your DPS a bit. But in general, Calypso's Radiance is not super useful, but it is generally broadly useful in life drain and curse. You could use that on almost any boss. Well, any boss. So I wouldn't put it in an S tier, but I think I'm going to put it beside Behemoth, just because it has kind of that similar swapping utility to it. Next we have Soulweaver. So most people don't use Soulweaver, including myself, or really Bane dolls at all. 63 attack is good for Legendary. It's not as good as Calypso's Radiance. Watcher's Visage is pretty good for the doll. It's a cooldown version of Dark Curse. And then it's got Lacerate and Maw boost, which are helpful, but not great. I think the niche for Bane dolls is kind of similar to the niche for daggers, just that they don't do it as well, is the fact that some of the attacks, specifically Plague, do percent-based damage, like Wound, but you only have that one attack, and you can't use it all the time. It's very voodoo, cost, expensive. So its broad DPS ends up being worse than just using Plague, because you can't use just Plague all the time. Its DPS ends up being relatively weak. It's sort of around what Web's DPS is, which actually isn't that great, around BC range, but worse. Since it doesn't have a good niche, most people don't like dolls. You don't really... It's harder to go specifically for this because it's in a set of 3. I'm going to put it in D tier. Okay, I've made everyone wait long enough for this. Now we have Storm Sphere. Storm Sphere is an immediate S tier. It's the only legendary grenade. It's got the highest attack, 4 grenades. It's got long volley boost, which helps its damage. It's got demolition boost, excuse me, which makes it a lot higher of an area, which makes it easier to farm enemies with. Maelstrom charge is very good damage. At this point in the game, they changed the amount of boost that you get from putting points into an ammo, so siege charge is now higher damage than Maelstrom once again. But Maelstrom is still very good. It does take your health, so you have to use it a little bit more sparingly. But it's very good DPS. It's top DPS. And there's also tricks that you can use to make it better than it's intended, which really break the scales. So it's definitely an S tier. Okay, now we're on to stabs. Hollow Gem is a very good weapon in my opinion. It's got good attack for stabs. It's got a lot of good boosts to it for damage. And Desolation on stabs is generally very good DPS. It's hard to use it actively, but it also has Desolation resistance, which helps. But those generally about like maybe high B tier DPS. And then it's also got Jumpy Fire, which makes it unique, and I think gives it a really nice niche. Jumpy Fire is just a better version of Flaming Skull, but it's better enough that you end up being able to chunk through a lot of enemies. Not really your highest health enemies, but middling enemies, like enemies that would be on Black Pearl or on flagships, when you're farming for Triton, on Queen Anne's Revenge. All of those enemies you can kill with Gem really easily, and that just helps that farming process, and there's a lot of items from those that are useful to be trying to go for. So I think its niche is very good. I think its damage is generally pretty good. It's not really going to be your highest DPS option. It's more going to be for the niches. So I don't think it's broadly useful, so it doesn't really deserve S tier to me, but I think it's an A tier. Rebirth, I think most people would put very low because it's not going to be very good DPS, and I agree with that at least. But what makes it unique, what its niche is, the role that it fills in my opinion, it's not healing, is coming from the Pestilence boost. Pestilence, if you don't know, gives you 5% damage when it hits, which is every 2 seconds, on the base health of whatever enemy you're attacking. So basically like wound, but it's happening every 2 seconds for 5%. And that really adds up over time. And so if you can get Pestilence boost on it, that increases the amount of time it's active. And so you get a lot of ticks, and that lets you be able to start a fight that would otherwise take you a while with Pestilence boost. And then over time you're going to be doing 30% of the boss's health just from that alone on top of what you're already attacking. So your stack DPS can get very high with it. And so I think it has a really good niche when you're struggling with bosses. Maybe you could do that, switch to something that heals so that you can stay alive, that kind of thing. Again, I really like the concept of that, those situations, but it is more ideal if you don't get into those situations where you need to do something weird. So interesting niche, but not amazing. So I'm going to put it kind of the same reason that I would Dark Whisper in B tier. Okay, next we have all the sailing items. The only one that pertains to land looting, land fighting, is Beckett Spyglass, because it has Barrage Boost, which boosts your grenade damage just a little bit. It's not really essential. I kind of want to pair it up with an S tier. Storm Sphere is S tier, but I feel like that's hard to justify, especially since it only buffs grenades. So I think I'm just going to put it in like B tier. It's not really essential, but it is nice. And then for the other sailing items, I'm just putting them in F. Not that they're bad, they're just nice little land looting, and that's kind of what I'm focusing on here. And that's all the legendaries. I also wanted to put in some kind of runner-ups, honorable mentions for famed weapons that I think are interesting. So Dark Idol, that dagger is just a baby version of Whisper, if Whisper is too hard to get, but you kind of like the idea of Whisper when you're starting out, then you could go for this, and it's going to be a bit easier to get than the legendary, hopefully. It's definitely worse, like I said, than Whisper, so I'm not going to put it higher than Whisper, so it's going to get a C tier. Next we have the image of Divine Musket, but also Brigadier's Musket. Those two are competing for the highest gun damage, just at least for a single shot, not for their DPS. And this could be used to snipe enemies from safety and kill them without any risk, or to also just get quick damage on a boss. Ideally you would do that and then not pull aggro, which is a little bit trickier, and that's harder to set up, so most people wouldn't do that. So probably a low-ish B tier item, I think. Next we have another combo. This is just Doomstinger image, but Doomstinger and Blight Fang are kind of a pair here. They're also not really used, in my opinion, but given that they have poison and fire damage on them, those dots can stack and do a lot of damage, similar to kind of what we see in Hornet Stinger, and how that gets really high DPS. Same way, Doomstinger and Blightfang able to get very high DPS on high health targets. So this doesn't make it S tier. It is broadly useful, but it's not going to be top DPS. It's roughly, I would say, high DPS, so kind of in the A tier. And then finally, Tyrant Blade. Mentioned this way back at the beginning when I was talking about Web, but this is kind of the famed baby version of Web. It does have pretty good attack. Ice Curses, Cursed Ice is okay, and its drain health is going to be less than other ones, but it's usually enough to stay alive in a fair amount of situations. So I think can't be S tier really with Web, but I think it's safe to put it up in A tier. And that is everything. So let me know what you think. Maybe I'm very wrong with my tier list here. Let me know.